The world she was born into was one of contrasting darkness and light, a world on the cusp of monumental change, where the very fabric of society was being torn apart by the violent tug-of-war between monarchy and parliament. England, 1598. It was a time when fate seemed to smile upon the few and leave the many in the shadows of history. But Elizabeth Borgia, the daughter of an ancient noble family, would find her place in the pages of that turbulent history. The story of Elizabeth is not merely a tale of a noblewoman, a wife, or a mother. It is the story of a woman whose strength was tested by time, politics, and love. It is the story of how she, though often a silent witness to the storms of history, quietly became one of its most steadfast figures. As the daughter of Sir John Borgia, a man well established in the aristocratic circles of England, Elizabeth was raised amidst the wealth and privilege of the elite. Yet, from an early age, she was aware that her destiny was never hers alone to command. It was a truth as ingrained in her as the lavish gowns she wore and the fine manor house that stretched before her eyes. The Borgias were bound by ties of loyalty to the monarchy. Yet as the years passed, those ties would be tested, and in time, they would snap, dragging Elizabeth into the maelstrom of political and religious conflict that would define her life. In the midst of such chaos, a young and ambitious Oliver Cromwell entered her world, a man whose fate, like hers, would forever alter the course of history. Elizabeth's life, up until her marriage to Cromwell, had been one of conventional beauty and courtly grace, characteristic of a young noblewoman in Elizabethan England. She was well-educated, a lover of literature and the arts, and above all, a woman deeply devout to her faith. Her father, Sir John Borgia, was an influential figure in the court of Queen Elizabeth I, known for his diplomatic ties and support for the monarchy. The Borgias, with their long lineage dating back to the Norman conquest, were well respected in the court, but not without their own quiet ambitions. Elizabeth's family maintained a delicate balance between loyalty to the crown and an understanding of the shifting tides of English politics. There were whispers among their peers of political maneuvering, allegiances to powerful families, and promises made in quiet corridors. But to Elizabeth, those matters seemed distant and foreign until, one fateful evening, she was introduced to the young man who would become her husband. Oliver Cromwell, unlike the suave, polished men who frequented the court, was not a nobleman by birth. He was, however, a man of remarkable ambition, a quality that had caught the eye of many influential figures in his rise through the ranks. He was not handsome in the traditional sense, nor was he of commanding presence like some of the noble suitors who sought Elizabeth's hand. But there was something in his eyes, an unspoken resolve, a quiet determination that Elizabeth could not ignore. She first saw him at a dinner hosted by her uncle, and even then, she could not quite place why he seemed different from the others. His conversation was thoughtful, but there was an undercurrent of something darker, something unyielding. Their courtship was swift, and soon Elizabeth found herself captivated by the very man who would change the course of English history. But her decision to marry Cromwell was not without its consequences. Her family, deeply entrenched in the traditional structures of the English nobility, did not fully understand her choice. Oliver, after all, was not a man of aristocratic birth, and many saw him as an outsider. Yet Elizabeth felt drawn to him, not only because of his sharp intelligence, but because of his unshakable faith. For Elizabeth, it was faith that bound them, a mutual understanding that there was a higher calling than the material world they lived in. They married in 1620, when Elizabeth was just 20 years old. Their union, though based on love, was also a strategic one, a coming together of two families whose paths were about to cross in the most unlikely of ways. Their early years together were relatively peaceful, and Elizabeth quickly adapted to the life of a wife, balancing her duties with her growing involvement in the complex world of English politics. She bore Cromwell 5 children, each of whom would later play their own roles in the tumultuous events that followed. But it was not long before the winds of change began to blow through England. The peaceful life they had known would soon be shattered by the coming storm, the storm that was the English Civil War. As the decade turned and the 1630s arrived, tensions between King Charles I and Parliament began to reach a breaking point. The king's disregard for the rights of Parliament and his attempts to enforce religious conformity set the stage for open conflict. Elizabeth, as much as she loved her husband, could not ignore the growing whispers of rebellion and the brewing conflict that seemed to be rising all around her. Oliver Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, began to show signs of his own disillusionment with the monarchy. But Elizabeth, although aware of his growing political engagement, had always hoped that the family would remain untouched by the larger forces at play. That was a dream soon shattered when Cromwell, driven by his own sense of righteousness, joined the parliamentary forces in the struggle against King Charles. As the war escalated, Elizabeth's world transformed. From the comfort of their home in Huntingdon, she soon found herself swept into the chaos of war, political maneuvering, and a conflict that would tear the country and her family apart. Cromwell rose through the ranks of the new model army, gaining influence and commanding victories that would ultimately lead to the downfall of the monarchy. But with each success, Elizabeth felt the weight of his ambition, the toll it took on their family, and the ever-growing divide between her personal life and the larger struggles of the nation. In the years following their marriage, Oliver Cromwell's rise from a country gentleman to a political and military force was nothing short of extraordinary. For Elizabeth, this period marked the slow unraveling of the quiet, domestic life she had once dreamed of, a life centered around her children, her faith, and her community. Instead, she found herself at the heart of a conflict that would consume not only her husband but the very fabric of England itself. At the outset of the English Civil War in 1642, Elizabeth's initial reaction was one of disbelief. Like many women of her time, she had lived much of her life sheltered from the brutal realities of politics and war. To her, Oliver had always been a man of principle, a devout Puritan with a strong sense of right and wrong. But now, as the storm clouds of war gathered on the horizon, her husband was preparing to enter a conflict that would forever change both England and their family. It was in these early days that Elizabeth first felt the weight of Oliver's political ambitions. While she had supported his career in Parliament, she had not truly understood the depth of his commitment to the Puritan cause or his belief in the righteousness of the parliamentary struggle. To her, the monarchy was a symbol of stability, a foundation of the world she had grown up in. But to Oliver, it represented everything that was wrong with England: tyranny, corruption, and an unholy union between church and state. Oliver's decision to take up arms against the king was not one made lightly. The Cromwell family had always maintained a relatively neutral stance, walking a fine line between loyalty to the crown and the pressures of an increasingly restless parliament. Yet, as the king's actions became more authoritarian, Oliver found himself drawn into the conflict with a sense of divine duty. For him, the war was not merely a political struggle but a holy war, a battle between the forces of righteousness and the forces of tyranny. For Elizabeth, the war presented a profound personal dilemma. She loved her husband deeply, and she had always admired his sense of conviction. But the prospect of war, of seeing her husband march off to fight, filled her with a deep and abiding dread. She knew that once Oliver entered the fray, there would be no turning back. The life they had known, the life of relative peace and prosperity, would be shattered forever. She had always been a woman of deep faith, but now her faith would be tested in ways she never anticipated. It was easy to believe in God's will when life was calm, when the greatest trials were those of daily domestic life. But now, as the specter of war loomed, she found herself praying not just for peace, but for the safety of her children and her husband. Despite her reservations, Elizabeth never once voiced her opposition to Oliver's decision to fight. She knew that the man she had married was not one to be swayed by emotional appeals. Instead, She chose to support him in the only way she knew how, by maintaining their household and caring for their children. As Oliver prepared to leave for the front lines, Elizabeth assumed the mantle of protector and mother, her own role becoming ever more crucial as the conflict escalated. It was not long before Oliver was named a colonel in the Parliamentarian army. His rise was swift, fueled by both his military acumen and his unflinching religious zeal. He became a key figure in the new model army, a force designed to bring discipline and order to the parliamentarian cause. It was during this time that Elizabeth's life began to unravel in ways she could not have foreseen. In the summer of 1644, Oliver's army faced one of the war's most decisive battles at the Siege of York. As the parliamentarian forces surrounded the royalists in the city, Oliver and his men fought with an intensity that mirrored his growing belief in the righteousness of their cause. For Elizabeth, the news of the siege reached her like a thunderclap, a harbinger of the violent path her husband was on. Every day, she waited for word, her heart heavy with the fear that she might lose him in battle. As the days passed, she found herself retreating into her prayers, the only refuge she had left. It was during these long, solitary nights that she came to a profound realization. The man she had married was no longer the same man who had once sat beside her in their parlor. He had been transformed, not just by the demands of war, but by a conviction so deep that it had become a part of his very being. She was proud of him, yes, but also fearful. Oliver's commitment to the Puritan cause was consuming him, and with every victory, his political power grew. York, Oliver's forces achieved a hard-fought victory, and the parliamentarians took control of the city. It was a turning point in the war, one that cemented Oliver's position as one of the most capable military commanders in England. But for Elizabeth, the victory brought little comfort. She had watched her husband evolve from a man of conviction to a man of war, and now there was no going back. Though she was not on the battlefield, Elizabeth was not without her own role to play in the war. As the wife of one of the most influential men in Parliament, she was thrust into the political circles that surrounded the conflict. She began to receive letters from supporters of the parliamentary cause, people who admired Oliver's leadership and wanted to offer their support. These letters often contained requests for donations, for supplies, and for political favor. Elizabeth, ever the dutiful wife, took it upon herself to manage these affairs. She became the de facto head of their household, managing the family's finances and overseeing the care of their estate. She also became a source of support for her husband's soldiers, sending them food and supplies when needed. But even as she threw herself into these tasks, Elizabeth's heart remained divided. She could never fully reconcile her love for her husband with the increasing toll the war was taking on their family. By the end of 1645, Oliver's army had triumphed at Naseby, and the royalist forces were in retreat. Yet, Elizabeth found no solace in these victories. As Oliver's star rose, so did the pressure on their family. The war was far from over, and as Oliver moved further into the political sphere, the personal cost of his ambition became ever more apparent. He was no longer the man she had married. He was now a leader, a symbol, a man driven by forces beyond her understanding. As the war raged on, England transformed before Elizabeth Borlas's very eyes. The royalist forces, defeated at Naseby, were on the back foot, their control crumbling, while Oliver's influence and military might grew ever stronger. With each passing year, Elizabeth was confronted by the growing distance between the man she had married and the figure he was becoming, an instrument of divine will, a symbol of the Puritan cause, and, most unsettling of all, a man whose power now threatened to eclipse all else, including their family life. The victories at Naseby and other key battles left Elizabeth caught between the deepening admiration she felt for Oliver's strategic brilliance and the dread that settled in her heart with every battle won. Though she loved her husband with a fierce loyalty, she couldn't shake the feeling that something within him, something fundamental, was changing. The Cromwell she had once known, the quiet country gentleman, was becoming a force that seemed to bend destiny itself. Oliver now appeared in the public eye as an almost otherworldly figure, a commander and statesman whose reputation spread beyond England's borders. As Parliament's most prominent general, he was not only winning the war but also reshaping the political landscape, toppling a king and declaring that England would never be the same. But for Elizabeth, the fruits of these victories were bittersweet. She had once believed that Oliver's commitment to the cause was about justice, about making England a better place for their children and for future generations. Yet, as his influence grew, so too did the complexities of his decisions. It was no longer simply about battle strategies. It was about who would sit on England's throne and who would rule the future of the nation. Perhaps the most profound and irrevocable shift came with the trial and execution of King Charles I. Elizabeth's heart was torn in two. She knew her husband played a critical role in the king's downfall, that Oliver and other leaders of Parliament had brought the monarch to trial for treason. But her own loyalty to the crown, despite her support for the parliamentary cause, made this act of regicide a wound that would never fully heal. As news of the king's execution spread across England, the nation was shaken to its core. For Elizabeth, it was as though a veil had been lifted, and what she had once perceived as a righteous war now seemed fraught with moral ambiguity. The execution was not merely the end of a king's reign. It was the beginning of a new era, one in which the very foundations of England's political and religious structures were being rewritten. Oliver, always steadfast in his belief that he was serving a higher purpose, felt no such conflict. To him, the king's execution was an act of divine justice. He believed that it was the will of God that England be freed from tyranny, and that the monarch's death was necessary for the salvation of the nation. Yet, Elizabeth could not help but feel the weight of this decision, the enormity of what had been done. The emotional strain on her was immense. She had always been a woman of deep faith, but now she found herself questioning the righteousness of her husband's actions. Was Oliver truly following God's will, or had ambition and power clouded his judgment? How could she reconcile the loving husband she had once known with the man now hailed as a hero of the new republic? By 1653, Oliver Cromwell's role had evolved once again, no longer just a general or a member of Parliament. He was now the Lord Protector of England. The monarchy had been abolished, and England was declared a Commonwealth. Oliver was the de facto ruler, holding power with a firm hand, and Elizabeth found herself at the center of a revolution that, though seemingly triumphant, filled her with a deep sense of unease. In the private chambers of their home, Elizabeth saw a side of Oliver that no one else did. A man burdened by the weight of the crown he had never asked for but had reluctantly come to wear. The title of Lord Protector did not bring the peace he had once hoped for. Instead, it seemed to further isolate him. Where once he had been a man of humility and faith, now he was a ruler, faced with the constant challenges of maintaining order in a nation that was anything but united. Elizabeth's role during this time was crucial. As the wife of the Lord Protector, she was no longer simply a mother and homemaker. She was a figurehead, a symbol of the new regime, a woman who had once been a country noblewoman but was now thrust into the heart of political power. Yet even as she performed her duties with grace, she often felt as though she were playing a role, trapped in a life that no longer felt her own. There were moments of tenderness between them, brief moments when Oliver would seek her counsel or express his fears, but these were increasingly rare. As his power grew, so too did his detachment from everything he had once held dear. The man she had married, the quiet Puritan with his convictions and his desire to improve the country, seemed to have vanished, replaced by a ruler who sometimes appeared haunted by the very power he had sought. Elizabeth was not naive. She knew the political landscape was fraught with danger. The enemies of Cromwell, both within and outside of England, were many, and the stability of the Commonwealth was constantly under threat. She had seen enough to understand the precariousness of her husband's position. But despite these dangers, Elizabeth remained steadfast. She supported Oliver, not just as a political figure but as the man she had married, the father of their children, and the man whose vision had shaped the course of her own life. With Oliver's rise to power, their family life became increasingly strained. The demands of his office kept him away for long periods, leaving Elizabeth to care for their children and manage the household affairs. She had 5 surviving children, each of whom had their own aspirations and burdens. Some of them, like their father, were deeply involved in politics, while others, like her beloved daughter, were drawn to more personal, quiet lives. But each one had been touched by the monumental changes in England, and they would all be shaped by their father's legacy. Her children's lives were no longer ordinary. They were entwined with the future of England. The eldest, Robert, had already distinguished himself in Parliament, while others, like her son Richard, found themselves faced with the uncertainty of the new regime. The idea that they might inherit not just wealth or land, but the weight of political power hung heavily over their heads. Elizabeth often found herself reflecting on her own role in all of this. She had been a witness to history, yes, but more than that, she had been part of it. Her love for Oliver had carried her through trials she could not have foreseen. But now she wondered what the future held for them, for her family, and for England, the country she had known as a child. The one ruled by a monarch was gone forever, replaced by something far more fragile and uncertain. Throughout these turbulent years, Elizabeth's faith was her anchor, but it was a faith that was increasingly tested. She had always believed in the righteousness of Oliver's cause, but now she found herself questioning the cost of that righteousness, the weight of her husband's decisions, the sacrifices they had made, and the toll on their family were undeniable. Yet, in the darkest moments, when doubt crept into her heart, she found solace in her prayers, hoping that, in the grand design of God's will, their suffering would eventually have a purpose. As the years passed, the weight of Oliver Cromwell's power began to settle heavily on his shoulders. Once a general whose victories had led England's forces to triumph, Oliver now faced an entirely new challenge: ruling a nation divided, fractured by war and haunted by the legacy of a dead monarchy. The Commonwealth that he had fought so hard to establish was now in a fragile state. The sense of divine favor that had once guided him was now clouded by doubt. Elizabeth, always a steady presence in Oliver's life, watched as the very foundation of their world seemed to shift beneath them. The title of Lord Protector had never been one Oliver had fully embraced. It was thrust upon him, first reluctantly accepted, and ultimately consumed him. The man who had once been a humble country gentleman, a man of faith with a simple, clear vision, had now become an entrenched ruler, battling not only royalists and parliamentarians but also the intense expectations of a nation that had placed its hopes in him. As the protectorate grew, so did the complexities of Oliver's rule. The absence of a monarchy left a vacuum, and it became clear that the idea of a republic, while initially appealing to many, was unsustainable. Oliver's attempt to establish a military-backed government, governed by Puritan ideals, faced intense opposition. The tensions between the army, the parliament, and the people grew, leading to constant unrest. For Elizabeth, this turmoil was more than just political, it was personal. The man she had married, the man she had supported, was now the subject of both admiration and deep criticism. Even within their home, Oliver seemed a shadow of the man he had once been. Oliver, though a devout believer in God's providence, was increasingly isolated in his decision-making. The once close relationship he shared with Elizabeth began to fray. He no longer sought her counsel as he had in their earlier years. His decisions were made with an urgency that left little room for discussion. Where once they had shared a life of faith and ambition, now there was a growing silence, a sense of distance. In private, Elizabeth saw her husband increasingly haunted by the question of what kind of legacy he would leave. The mantle of protector, which he had once worn with pride, began to feel like a burden too great to bear. the weight of the crownless throne pressed upon him. And Elizabeth could see in his eyes that his once unshakable conviction was beginning to waver, while Oliver struggled with his role as ruler. The Cromwell family was also facing its own crises. Their children, once so full of promise and potential, were now navigating the uncertain world left by the collapse of the monarchy. Some were involved in the politics of the day, supporting their father's regime, while others felt the weight of the shifting political tides. As much as Elizabeth tried to keep the family together, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the sense of unity that had once defined them. Richard, their son, had become increasingly involved in his father's government. However, he was not a man of the same resolve as Oliver. Where Oliver had built his reputation on his military prowess and faith, Richard was more introspective, more reserved, while Oliver trusted him. Elizabeth could see that Richard was not suited for the burdens of leadership. As Richard took on more responsibility within the protectorate, Elizabeth feared for his future. She saw in him the same doubts and insecurities that plagued Oliver, and she feared that Richard's fate might mirror that of his father. A man driven by faith and duty, but ultimately undone by the very ideals that had propelled him. For the younger children, like Henry and Elizabeth Jr., the future seemed even more uncertain. They were too young to understand the complexities of politics, but they could feel the tension that permeated their home. As Oliver's rule began to unravel, Elizabeth struggled to shield them from the harsh realities of a world that no longer seemed to offer the stability it once had. By 1657, the fractures within the Commonwealth were impossible to ignore. The military, which had once been the backbone of Oliver's power, began to fracture. A growing faction of parliamentarians, disillusioned by the absence of a monarchy and the increasingly autocratic nature of the protectorate, began to demand reforms. The people, too, were restless. The idea of a government ruled by a single man, even a man as seemingly righteous as Oliver, began to feel like anathema to the very ideals of democracy and freedom that had been at the heart of the parliamentary struggle. Oliver had always believed that his rule was divinely ordained, that he was fulfilling God's will by maintaining control over England. But now, he found himself facing a nation that seemed less and less convinced of the righteousness of his cause. Parliamentarians, who had once been loyal to the cause of the revolution, began to question Oliver's authority. The growing unrest reached a boiling point in 1657, when Oliver was offered the title of king by a faction within Parliament. It was an offer that filled Oliver with both revulsion and desperation. To become king was, in his mind, to betray everything he had fought for, to return to the very system of monarchy that had caused so much suffering in England. For Elizabeth, the offer of kingship represented the pinnacle of the contradictions that had come to define their lives. She had always believed that Oliver's rule was about more than just power. It was about the hope of a better, more just England. But now, the very idea of kingship seemed like a betrayal of the ideals they had both fought for. When Oliver rejected the offer, it seemed as though the last threads of the protectorate's legitimacy began to unravel. The kingdom that Oliver had worked so hard to create, an England without a king, was beginning to break down under the pressure of political strife. Elizabeth, once so proud of her husband's vision, now began to question whether the sacrifices had been worth it. As the years passed, Oliver's health began to fail. The stress of ruling, coupled with the political instability of the Commonwealth, took its toll. Elizabeth watched helplessly as her husband, once so vigorous and determined, became a shadow of himself. The man she had once known as a leader of men was now frail, worn down by years of warfare and political intrigue. In the last months of his life, Oliver became more introspective, often spending hours in prayer, reflecting on the decisions he had made and the path he had chosen. Elizabeth, ever his steadfast companion, did her best to comfort him, but she could not ease the burden of his thoughts. It was during this time that Oliver began to speak of the possibility of resigning from power, of stepping down and allowing England to return to some form of monarchy or parliamentary rule. But Elizabeth knew that by this point, the damage had already been done. The Commonwealth was unsustainable, and Oliver's health was too far gone to repair the fractures he had created. When Oliver Cromwell died on September 3rd, 1658, the nation was left in a state of uncertainty. His death marked the end of an era, but for Elizabeth, it was a moment of both grief and relief. She had lost her husband, the man she had loved and followed, but she had also lost the weight of his ambitions and the expectations that had come with his rule. In the years following Oliver's death, Elizabeth found herself facing a new reality. The country was on the brink of collapse, with factions of parliament and royalists fighting for control. Her son Richard, who had briefly succeeded his father as Lord Protector, found himself unable to maintain control of the country, and in 1659, he was forced to abdicate. The Commonwealth, as a political entity, was effectively over. For Elizabeth, this was both a loss and a liberation. She had spent so many years supporting Oliver's cause, believing in the righteousness of his mission. But now, in the wake of his death and the collapse of the Commonwealth, she was left to rebuild her life, to navigate a world that seemed, once again, uncertain. The man she had once known, the man who had led a nation to war and ruled with an iron will, was gone. But Elizabeth remained, a woman whose faith and resilience had seen her through the darkest moments of history. Elizabeth Cromwell stood by the window of her chambers in the Cromwell family estate, gazing out at the quiet fields beyond. The world that had once felt so alive, so full of possibility, now seemed distant, as if it were a different time altogether. Oliver was gone, and with him, the dream of a republic, a commonwealth free from the shackles of monarchy. In the silence of her widowhood, Elizabeth grappled with both a profound sense of loss and a growing understanding that the past could never be undone. Her life had been irrevocably altered by the turbulent years she had spent alongside Oliver, witnessing the rise and fall of a political experiment that had promised so much but had crumbled under the weight of ambition, power, and the harsh realities of governing. Now, as she faced a new chapter, she wondered how she could possibly move forward. How could she reconcile the woman she had been with the woman she had become? And what did the future hold for her and her family? In the years following Oliver's death, England was swept by political upheaval. The Commonwealth, which had been built on ideals of republicanism and religious freedom, rapidly began to unravel. The people, disillusioned with the constant instability, looked for stability wherever they could find it. And in 1660, that stability came in the form of Charles II, the son of the executed King Charles I, who was invited to return from exile and reclaim the throne of England. For Elizabeth, the restoration of the monarchy was a bitter pill to swallow. The monarchy that had been abolished by her husband and the forces of Parliament was now being resurrected, and with it, the very institution that had once caused so much strife in the country. Charles II's return was not just the return of a king. It was the return of a world Elizabeth had once known but had hoped never to see again. The ideals of the Commonwealth, the promise of a better, more just England, seemed lost, replaced by the opulence and indulgence of the Stuart monarchy. But Elizabeth was no longer the young woman who had stood by Oliver's side during the early days of the Revolution. She was a widow, a mother, and a survivor of the political and personal storm that had engulfed her life. Though she mourned the loss of the dreams she had shared with Oliver, she knew that the world had moved on, and so must she. In the years after Oliver's death, Elizabeth found herself reflecting on the legacy he had left behind. He had been a man of extraordinary ambition and conviction, driven by a sense of divine purpose that had shaped every aspect of his life. But now, in the quiet aftermath, Elizabeth began to see the toll that his pursuit of power had taken, not just on him, but on their family and the nation he had sought to remake. Their children, once so full of promise and potential, were now living in a world that seemed to offer them little direction. Richard, who had briefly succeeded Oliver as Lord Protector, was a man out of place in the monarchy's restoration. His reign had been short and ineffective, and after his abdication, he faded into the background of history. Henry, who had once been an eager participant in his father's political machinations, now found himself struggling to find his place in a country that was no longer shaped by his father's vision. Elizabeth, their daughter, and the rest of their children were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered dream. For Elizabeth, the burden of this legacy was heavy. She had devoted her life to her husband's cause, believing in the righteousness of his mission. Yet now, as the monarchy returned and the Commonwealth was consigned to the past, she wondered whether it had all been in vain. Was it possible to preserve the ideals of the Revolution in a world that had so quickly reverted to old ways? As England transitioned back to monarchy, Elizabeth found herself navigating a complicated and uncertain future. Though she was no longer the wife of the Lord Protector, her position as a Cromwell remained significant. Her family's name, once synonymous with revolutionary zeal, was now a symbol of a fallen dream. For many, the Cromwell family was a reminder of the ideals of the Commonwealth, ideals that were now seen by many as radical and dangerous. Elizabeth, however, refused to be defined solely by the past. She was determined to find her own path, even if it meant living in the shadow of Oliver's ambition. In these years of political uncertainty, Elizabeth focused much of her energy on her children, particularly her younger ones, who were still struggling to find their footing in this new world. She instilled in them a sense of dignity and responsibility, reminding them that their family's legacy, though marked by the failure of the Commonwealth, was also one of courage and conviction. They had been part of a historical moment, and that history could not simply be erased. Elizabeth's role in society had changed as well. No longer a political figure in the making, she had become a mother and a widow seeking a semblance of peace. She became known in certain circles for her quiet wisdom, and people would seek her counsel not as a leader but as a woman who had lived through the most extraordinary events of the century. She spoke often of the lessons she had learned in the years she had spent by Oliver's side, the importance of faith, of perseverance, and of humility in the face of power. These were the values that would shape her family's future. Even as the world around her continued to shift and change, the return of Charles II marked the official end of the Commonwealth. But for Elizabeth, it was a moment of reckoning. The dream that she and Oliver had shared, that England would be a republic, free from the tyranny of monarchy, was over. The monarchy's return was not just the restoration of a king. It was the restoration of everything that Oliver had fought against. It was the return of the old order, the very system that had oppressed so many and that had driven them to fight for a new England. For Elizabeth, this was a deep personal loss. She had sacrificed so much, her own peace, her family's stability, and her own personal happiness, all in the name of a cause she believed was just. Yet now, that cause seemed a distant memory, overshadowed by the return of a system that she had hoped to leave behind forever. The people cheered for the return of the king, but Elizabeth could not share in their celebration. She had lived through too much to be so easily swept up in the tides of political change. As time passed, the Cromwell family faded into the background of history. Elizabeth, once the wife of the Lord Protector, now lived a quiet life, removed from the political stage. She watched as England settled back into the rhythms of monarchy, but she knew that things would never be the same. The world had changed, irrevocably, and there was no going back. For Elizabeth, the question now was not what had been lost, but what could still be salvaged from the wreckage. In the final years of her life, Elizabeth found solace in her faith and in the quiet moments spent with her family. Though she had lived through one of the most tumultuous periods of English history, she had survived, and in her survival, she had found a deeper understanding of herself and the world around her. She had loved a man who had changed the course of history, but in the end, she had learned that history was not something that could be controlled. It was something that happened, regardless of one's will. Elizabeth's death in 1665 marked the end of an era, not just for her family but for England as a whole. She had lived through the rise and fall of the Commonwealth, the death of a king, and the restoration of another. She had been both witness and participant in a revolution that had promised so much but had ultimately failed to deliver the lasting change it had hoped for. Yet, in the quiet of her final days, Elizabeth found peace, knowing that her journey had been one of faith, of love, and of resilience in the face of adversity. As she passed from this world, the memory of Oliver, of their shared dreams, and of their place in history faded. But the lessons they had learned, the importance of faith, the cost of ambition, and the strength found in enduring love remained. By the time Elizabeth Cromwell entered her final years, the world around her had become a shadow of the one she had once fought to create. The turbulent era of the English Commonwealth, the bold, revolutionary experiment her husband Oliver had spearheaded, had collapsed, leaving only echoes of ideals and empty promises. Yet, within Elizabeth's quiet reflection, the truth remained. Though the dream of a republic had faded into history, her legacy, and that of her family, was indelibly etched into the annals of England's transformation. The streets of London had seen much since the execution of King Charles I, and since the rise and fall of her husband's protectorate. The restoration of the monarchy had been a triumph for the royalists, and for many, it marked the return of normalcy. But for Elizabeth, now living as a widow, the return of Charles II felt like the closing of a chapter, an unsatisfying end to a story she had lived, loved, and suffered for. In the stillness of her estate, Elizabeth reflected on the years that had passed since Oliver's death, the bitter loss of a cherished dream, the dissolution of the family unity that had once been so important, and the political upheavals that had swept England had all left their scars. Yet, as she sat in the drawing room of her home, surrounded by family portraits, reminders of happier times, and the faint scent of lavender, she found herself at peace. She had survived it all, facing personal loss, political failure, and the ceaseless questions of her children about the meaning of their father's legacy. She had always been, above all, a woman of deep faith. In those quiet moments, Elizabeth reflected on the path that had led her to this point. The years of political intrigue and her role as the wife of the Lord Protector had shaped her, but they had also given her wisdom. She no longer saw her life through the lens of ambition, nor through the ideals of a regime that had once burned so brightly with revolutionary fire. What had once seemed like a failure to her now took on a more profound significance. Oliver's dream had not been realized in the way he had hoped, but the sacrifices made in pursuit of that vision had shaped a nation forever. The days grew quieter as Elizabeth entered her twilight years. Her family, though scattered and bruised by the collapse of the Commonwealth, had come together in a more peaceful way. Richard, having failed as Lord Protector, lived quietly away from the political stage. Henry, though still grappling with his own identity and the fall of his family's ideals, had found some comfort in a modest life. Elizabeth's children were her greatest source of joy, and despite the shifting tides of history, she made every effort to instill in them the values that had defined her marriage to Oliver: the importance of humility, of faith, and of perseverance. But it was not just her children who sought her out. As the years passed, those who had once opposed the Cromwellian regime came to her in search of a different perspective on the turbulent history that had shaped England. Former Puritans, veterans of the Revolution, even those who had suffered under Oliver's rule in the harshest of ways, visited her in the hopes of understanding what had truly transpired. One afternoon, an elderly man, an ex-soldier who had fought under Cromwell during the Civil War, came to speak with her. His eyes were full of curiosity and regret, the weight of history pressing upon his soul. "Madam Cromwell," he said, his voice trembling, "I was but a boy when I fought for your husband. I watched as we fought, as we took control, believing we were fighting for God's will. And yet, now, with the monarchy restored, I cannot help but wonder if we were wrong." Elizabeth's heart swelled with compassion. for she understood the weight of his words. "We all believed, in our way," she replied gently, "that we were doing God's will. But power is a double-edged sword. It has the power to build, but also to tear down." Her words, though simple, carried a lifetime of experience. She had learned the hard lessons of leadership, the cost of ambition, the toll of power, and the complexity of faith. In her own way, Elizabeth had come to terms with the fact that Oliver's dream, while noble in its inception, was always flawed. It had relied too much on human strength, on the belief that mankind could reshape the world according to its own design, without understanding that divine timing and wisdom were the true architects of history. The passing of time brought with it a sense of closure, and Elizabeth found herself preparing for the inevitable. She knew that her time was coming, that the world she had known was slipping away, and with it, the dreams that had once seemed so vital. But even in the face of death, Elizabeth did not despair. She had lived a full life, one marked by devotion, by sacrifice, and by a fierce love for her family and for the England that had shaped her. As she lay in her bed, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Elizabeth's thoughts turned to Oliver. Though she had seen him as a man of great ambition, she had always known his heart. He had been a man driven by a vision of a better England. But even more than that, he had been a man who believed in the power of faith to change the world. He had believed that, through God's will, they could build a society of justice, free from the oppression of monarchy. And while that dream had been shattered, it was not lost. Her final words, spoken softly to her daughter Elizabeth, were a reflection of her life's journey. "We were part of something greater than ourselves, my love, but God's plan is always unfolding, and what we see is not always what He sees. Trust in Him, and in His timing." Elizabeth Cromwell passed away in 1665, the same year that the Great Plague swept through London. Her death, though mourned by her family, was a quiet one. She had lived through one of the most tumultuous periods in English history, and yet she had found a sense of peace in her final days, knowing that she had done what she believed was right. Her legacy, though marked by the failure of the Commonwealth, was one of resilience, faith, and an unshakable commitment to her family. As Elizabeth's funeral procession made its way through the streets of London, it was clear that the Cromwell family's influence had faded. The monarchy had been restored, and with it, a return to the old ways. But the memory of Oliver Cromwell, though now viewed with ambivalence by many, remained a part of England's history. His ambition, his faith, and his determination had shaped a nation, even if that shape had been temporary. In the years following her death, England would continue to evolve, its political landscape shifting yet again as the monarchy struggled with its own challenges. But for those who remembered the Cromwells, Elizabeth's legacy lived on. She had been more than just a wife, more than just a mother. She had been a witness to history, and in her quiet, unassuming way, she had shaped it as well. Her life, though overshadowed by the grandeur of her husband's dreams, was a testament to the power of perseverance, to the enduring strength of faith, and to the quiet resilience of a woman who had stood by her husband through the storms of revolution and the challenges of power. The story of Elizabeth Cromwell, the wife of Oliver Cromwell, would live on not in the political records of the Commonwealth, but in the hearts of those who had known her, and in the lessons her life had taught.